Hey everyone, I am doing this live stream today to talk to you about cold weather. There is a lot of cold weather coming all across the United States and Canada now, and so a lot of people are getting very concerned. I'm getting emails and messages now from people who are new to goats and are worried because they don't know if their goats can handle colder temperatures. And the interesting thing is, these emails come from people all the way from Florida through Canada. So it doesn't really matter where you live. If the temperatures get colder than what you're used to, then you start to worry about your goats. And I certainly understand that. Especially if you have little goats like Nigerian dwarfs, you wonder how on earth can these little goats from Africa survive cold temperatures? And I want to reassure you that they can. So you've got to, be smart about it. But they can do great in cold temperatures. We've had Nigerian dwarfs in Illinois for almost 22 years. It'll be 22 years in April that we've had Nigerian dwarfs here. And we have never had a problem with any of our adults in winter. And we have had temperatures get as low as minus 25 Fahrenheit. And that is temperature. That is not wind chill. That is temperature, minus 25. So 25 below zero. And everybody, all the adults survived. The only thing that happened, and this is actually one of the only bad things that has ever happened in cold temperatures, is that we did have a kid that was 1 day old whose back legs got frostbitten. And so unfortunately, when legs get frostbitten, they fall off. When we had kids born at minus 15 degrees, we had the first time we had kids born in minus 15 degrees, it was triplet bucklings. And one of them had the tips of his ears freeze off because we had a blow dryer, but we were going back and forth between them. And one of them did not get his ears dried enough. And so the tips of them froze and fell off. And then one time when we had a kidding below zero, the second time we had a kidding below zero, we were so focused on the ears that we didn't even think about the tail. And unfortunately, the tip of a kid's tail froze and then fell off a week or two later. So if you have goats due to kid and it is below zero, then you absolutely need to be out there. You need to have a blow dryer, because they're never going to get dry without a blow dryer if it's below zero. And in fact, if it's below 20 now, I like to have a blow dryer to get the kids dry quickly, because you want, if they're too cold, they get hypothermia. And then the first thing to go is their sucking instinct, and they don't nurse, and everything just goes downhill from there. And then you got a lot to recover from. But I was actually going to talk about adults, because that was the main thing. I have all my notes here about talking about adults to make sure I get everything included. The most important thing when it comes to cold weather and your adult goats, or any goats really, is that they need to have a good shelter. And that means that it needs to be well ventilated, but not drafty, which I know sounds like a contradiction. When I used to hear that when I was new, I thought that sounds like it's a contradiction. How can it be well ventilated but not drafty? So I always explain that to people. What it means is that you need to have something open. We got lucky. The barns on our farm happen to have ridge vents. So there's always, it's a vent along the ridge of the roof line. So we always have that where some ammonia can escape. But then we also still leave open one door or one window on the east side of the barn. If there was a door or a window on the south side of the barn, we would leave it open, but there are none. So there's almost never wind comes from the east. And so that's why we open that door. We do keep our west doors and windows closed all winter, because the wind would be whipping in really badly there. So you want to keep a door or a window open on a side that the wind is not blowing from, so that ammonia can escape. And the other thing you need to be aware of, and so a three-sided shelter is fine. If you build a three-sided shelter, you need to make sure that it is open to the south. For most parts of the United States, you want it to be open to the south, because your prevailing wind in the winter is going to be coming from the north. And so even if you've got just a 3-sided shelter, the whole south side is open. You know, even Michigan State Extension says a 3-sided shelter for goats is fine in winter if it's open to the south. And the only time that is not okay is if you have a blizzard, and or if they tell you that there's going to be a snowstorm with a lot of really high winds, which is basically a blizzard. But even if they're not classifying it as a blizzard and they're saying there's going to be a lot of high winds and a lot of inches of snow, like a couple feet of snow, you might want to bring in your goats that are in a 3-sided shelter, or do something to cover up that third side, like nail some plywood across it, across most of it, you know, like 90% of it, so the goats still have a little door there. And the reason is just because if the wind is blowing the snow and it's swirling around, it can blow into the shelter and fill it up. So if you go to the post on my website, there's a picture there, goats in winter on thriftyhomesteader.com. There is a picture there of what our 3-sided shelters looked like when we had a blizzard about, I think it was in 2012 that we had a blizzard, and we brought our bucks live in 3-sided shelters year round, but we did bring the bucks in the barn when that was forecast. And I'm glad we did, because the next day we went out there and you could barely see the tops of the shelters, and they were completely full of snow. So the wind had been swirling it around and blowing it into the shelters. So they might have sort of been buried in there in snow if they had been left in there. So blizzards are kind of a whole different story than just cold temperatures. But goats can handle cold temperatures fine as long as they are not cold. Wet. As long as they're not wet. If they are wet, then that's a whole different story. And that's why goats giving birth in cold temperatures is so dangerous, and why you can have kids get hypothermia so fast, because they're born soaking wet. So for bedding, if you have straw available, bedding, straw is much warmer bedding than pine shavings. And those are pretty much the two most common things people use. We do deep bedding, which means that we do not clean out our barn in the winter. We just, every few days or whenever we start to see some, poop in there, we throw more straw in. So it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. And by March, the straw is a foot deep. And yeah, it's like a few hours to clean it out, but it keeps the goats warmer in the winter. It totally insulates them from the ground. And so it's a much better option than shavings. And so if you're down south and shavings is your only option and it's going to get down to the teens, don't worry about it. Like, that's not a big deal. But if you're up north and it's going to be below zero, then having straw is a little bit more important, because it's a lot colder. If you have any goats that are alone, that is really not good if you're getting below zero temperatures, because they get together like little sausages in a package and lay down next to each other to help keep each other warm. So it's, goats are herd animals and you never should have just one. But one of the emails I got was from someone who had a goat separated because she had coccidiosis, which you do not need to separate a goat for coccidiosis, because it's not contagious from goat to goat. It's a fecal oral contamination, and healthy goats are immune to it. So that goat needs to be, back with her herd so that she can stay warm. I talked about temperatures a little bit at the very beginning, but so like I said at the very beginning, we have had temperatures as low as -25 here in Illinois, and our goats did fine. All of our adults were fine. The only problems that we have had are with kids that are born in temperatures below zero because of the risk of frostbite. And then the one kid we had that was 1 day old that had its back legs freeze. So, and that was at -25. Anything warmer than -25 was not a problem. So, and we've had -15, -20 a lot of times. I think most winters we get down to -10, -15 for overnight lows, almost most winters. So that's not anything that healthy adult goats cannot handle. If you have a goat that is like really skinny because it has had parasite challenges or something like that, and it's going to be below zero, then you might want to think about putting a coat on it, which I do not normally recommend. Healthy goats do not need coats. And in fact, you could be signing their death sentence if you put one on them, because goats are just notorious for getting stuck on things. So that's why people always ask me, what are those plastic chains on your goat's neck? They're breakaway collars, and they break at 60 pounds, which is great because my goats most of my adult goats are more than 60 pounds. And I do find those collars hanging from the limbs of trees, hanging on gates and fences and stuff. So they did their job and they broke when the goat got the collar stuck. And so the only time I would put a coat on a baby goat is if it was like a day or two old. And again, below 0 Fahrenheit. Because they might have the first 24 hours, sometimes they might have a little bit more trouble maintaining their body temperature. And on that article, I talk about what we use for coats for baby goats, which, if we happen to have any 1-day-old kids when the temperatures are this low, which thankfully we don't do this anymore. Our first coats now are due April 1st. So we don't have to worry about kidding right now. Another question that people ask about are heat lamps. And adult goats do not need heat lamps. The end. Again, unless it's like super, super, super skinny, because, like you have a goat that's got a body condition of 5 because it just is getting over a heavy parasite load. And it's going to be like below 20, a goat like that, an adult goat like that, I might put a heat lamp for them, but I would have them in a separate place. Maybe put one buddy in there with them so that they're not lonely. But healthy adult goats do not need heat lamps. And in fact, the heat lamp is only going to be putting the heat down right here. So it's not going to warm up your whole barn by any means. And if it's below 0, the only area that is going to be warm is right below that heat lamp. Like that's it. Nothing outside of that is going to be warm. So it's a waste of electricity. And the worst thing about heat lamps is the risk of a barn fire. Every single year, somebody's barn burns down. Like I see it. I get Google alerts for news events for goats. And every single winter, there is a barn or 2 or 3 that burns down because of a heat lamp. And in fact, I personally know 2 people who have had fires. One man lost his sheep, all of his lambs, to a barn fire a long time, like 15 years ago. So this was a lesson I learned very early on, because I met him and heard his story about how his barn burned down because of a heat lamp, and he lost all of his lambs one year. And I also know a woman whose garage burned down because she had chicks in there with a heat lamp. And so if you are using heat lamps, you have to be incredibly careful that there is no way that it could possibly be knocked down. You don't just hook it on a nail. You need to make sure that it's like double and triple attached in multiple ways so that it will not fall down, because we actually did almost have a barn fire. Luckily, our daughter saw smoke and went running in there and was able to put it out with a bucket of water. It was just still a small fire smoldering in the straw. So do not use a heat lamp on adult goats because they do not need it. So Deborah says in the chat, we have had high temps one day to low winter temps the next day. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I know a lot of people say, oh, well, you're in Illinois, your goats are used to cold weather. But the reality is they're not used to cold weather like in September. We have hot summers just like everybody else where it's like 90 degrees, sometimes even 100 degrees. And every now and then we will get a crazy September day where it plummets down to 40 degrees. And it's like 40 degrees one day. And this is the kind of temperatures that like sometimes people down south get worried about even, it's like, well, it was 80 yesterday, but it's 40 today. Our goats have to deal with that too. It's just the time of year that, our goats deal with that, like in February, and heaven help us, March. I mean, March is just the most temperature schizophrenic kind of a month imaginable. In fact, I will never forget the time that I had 3 goats give birth 3 days in a row in March. And like the first day, it was 20 degrees. And it took those kids about an hour to start, like to get on their feet and start nursing. The next day, it was like 40 degrees. The kids were up and nursing in like half an hour. And the third day, it was like 60, 70 degrees. And those kids were on their feet within 5 minutes looking for the teat. And that was the thing that like really cemented in my brain the difference that temperature makes in kids being able to get up and start nursing soon after birth. And that's why, because I used to, honestly, I never used a blow dryer until we had our first below zero kidding. And then I just thought, oh, you need them for below zero kiddings. And then I was kind of like, yeah, you probably, you know what? I think it's beneficial if, even it's like 10 degrees. And now I'm like, oh, yeah, if it's below freezing, we'll use a blow dryer, because the quicker you get those kids dry and nursing, the less you have to worry. And the quicker they're dry, the quicker they're going to start nursing. Because just imagine if you were soaking wet and it was 10 degrees out or 20 degrees out, you would probably have muscle control issues also. And so it really is helpful for the kids if you can get them warm and dry as quickly as possible in terms of nursing. So make sure that your goats have a good shelter that if you're down south, I know a lot of times, one of the things about shelters, I know sometimes I hear from people down south who build shelters with pallets. If you did that, you need to make sure that you've got really good sheeting on the outside so that the wind is not going to be whipping through there, because that's like the most important thing about your shelter during really cold temperatures is that the wind is not able to blow through there. So you do not want wind to blow through there. Somebody contacted me once and said, my goats are shivering and it's 40 degrees. And I said, can you send me a picture? And they had like just put together some pallets with no siding on them and put a tarp over the top and called that a shelter. And it was raining and the goats were wet and the wind was blowing through those pallets. And so, of course they're shivering. Like they're cold and it's windy and they're wet. So it's very important that they're in a place where they're dry and that they're not going to have wind blowing through their shelter. No worries about insulating. Our barn is not insulated. It's just metal. That's it. So it's really, usually the temperature inside is the same as the temperature outside. So if it's 5 below zero outside, it's going to be 5 below inside our barn. So anyway, your goats will do fine as long as they are normally, healthy. They've got decent weight on them. You don't really need to do anything special. Just make sure that they are kept dry and out of the wind. And if you're watching this later and you have any questions, feel free to post in the comment section below. I also have an article on my website, thriftyhomesteader.com. The article is called Goats in Winter, and it's linked in the description of this post. Take care and stay warm. So we got below zero temperatures coming here in Illinois for about a week coming up. So we are right there with you guys. Take care. Bye.